Hi, everybody. The county board is now in session, and we are holding our budget work session today, a very different budget work session from any we've held before. Our manager is going to present a new, drastically revised budget for the current circumstances, and then we'll see if we have some questions, but mostly this is to get out what our staff has been thinking and is recommending in these extraordinary times. And I don't expect it to bear much resemblance to the 400 and something page budget that you took months to prepare earlier when we actually knew our revenues and our expenditures. So, Mr. Schwartz, with that exciting introduction, can you take it away?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. And we are going to have a slide presentation here, which hopefully will be cued to what I'm talking about, because as you know, I do not have the remote control on the slides. We have all seen some extraordinary events over the last month and a half, and we've seen a personal toll that's been borne by countless Americans and Arlingtonians, a physical toll, a mental toll, and then also an economic toll. Both businesses and residents have been affected by this incredible change in circumstances. Our schools are closed and our revenues are very much affected, which is the reason why I'm back to you now with a newly revised proposed budget for fiscal 2021. And let me emphasize that, we can go to the next slide. Let me emphasize that this budget is really a guide for the initial months coming up of the fiscal year, and it's certain that we will have to revisit it as needed. And we do not have the kind of precise revenue information we had hoped for, and we will have more that will become known as months go by. So let's start with an update on the current fiscal year where we are. So the impacts we're certain to see most immediately are in those taxes that are listed here in the first bullet: sales tax, meals tax, and transient occupancy tax, among others. We have seen, for example, several hotels in the county have to close doors. Our room rates, vacancy rates are in the 90% vacancy rate area. Meals tax obviously is affected by the drop in dine-in restaurants, and though some of our business restaurants are doing as good as could be hoped for with delivery services, they're clearly hurting, and sales tax is also expected to be down. We also have a number of non-tax sources that are listed here: parking meters and parking ticket revenue, the fees that we anticipated from our parks programs, and also development fees that are related to the filing of site plans for consideration by the county. So that's the impact on revenues. What we've been doing, and I've talked to this briefly in some earlier presentations to the community, is we're instituting an immediate hiring slowdown. Now, that doesn't mean we're not hiring anybody, but our hiring is going to be focused on those very critical positions, for example, in public health or public safety. We have made use as needed, and I'll get into more details on this, the county manager contingent, which was appropriated as part of the fiscal 20 budget. And we will be able to make use of the stabilization reserve. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. We're also going to be deferring or canceling capital projects. And then I would like to note that we will be slowing discretionary spending. This means, for example, we do not have overtime costs on a lot of shifts that we used to have, because we have gone to a double or in some case triple shift system in some of our departments, which means that we're not not all employees are coming to work as they normally would, given that some of them have to telework and some do not have the ability to telework and have been taking what we call civil leave. So there's been a drop off in expenditures in certain departments. And so we will see evidence of that as we move through the rest of this fiscal year. Let's go to the next slide. While we've been in the process of preparing a new proposed budget, and we're actually, as I said before, in the middle of fiscal 20. We have made some initial investments to deal directly with the impact of the COVID-19 virus. We have purchased essential supplies, for example, PPE, which is personal protective equipment and cleaning supplies. We've provided additional PPE for our frontline employees and provided some to our nonprofit partners. We've invested in technology, essentially going to a virtual workforce, in most instances, standing up a new backbone for technology. And we have virtualized all our call centers, and we're able to do our emergency communication center call intake and dispatch virtually, as well as provide a number of Department of Human Services functions that previously had required in-person visits. As I mentioned in a previous board meeting, allocated an additional $100,000 to the Arlington Food Assistance Center. We have worked closely with Virginia Hospital Center to stand up a remote testing center on Quincy Street. We have just completed an agreement among Virginia Hospital Center, ourselves, and the Arlington Free Clinic to provide a high-speed fiber connection that will allow telehealth, which is essentially allowing the clinic to do work with the hospital directly without having to actually have in-person visits of physicians or handing off paper records. And then also we have identified certain hotel areas in the county that we're going to be using as backup housing for people who cannot stay in congregate care settings. Additional steps that we are planning, sometime this week I will be announcing premium pay for those frontline employees who cannot work remotely and are in a situation where they often have to come within 6 feet of the clients that they serve or the residents. We're also, and I want to discuss this a little bit later, we have a proposal that we're going to make to the board for small business support through a grant program, and then possibly discuss a revolving loan fund concept for small businesses at a later date. And also, I'm going to bring to you sometime this week a proposal that would slow down the required payments by some of the county's Affordable Housing Investment Fund loan recipients. I just wanted to note on all these initial investments, other than that $100,000, are all done within regularly appropriated funds within the departments. So let's go on to the next slide. So I did not have the opportunity. Normally what happens is the county board provides me with budget guidance. You did that in November for a budget I proposed in February. Though I have had conversations with each of you, I have settled upon these 4 guiding principles about how I approach the revised budget. And you can see first and foremost would clearly be to make sure that we preserve and keep in place the funding for those immediate life safety services we provide to the community. For example, food, health, and housing. The second principle I've applied is to make sure we support the county workforce. Now, this has not been the universal approach among all jurisdictions in the United States facing this issue, but I feel very strongly I want to keep all our county employee positions intact and make sure that when we come out the other end that we have our infrastructure, our most important asset as a county, and in many ways is our staff, have them in place. So I'm not proposing any job cuts. The third area, and I've made reference to this in the previous slide, is to provide assistance to our business community and our nonprofits, many of whom are either hurting severely. Our businesses and our nonprofits have seen some very stressful times as we lean on them to provide more services to the community. And finally, and certainly not last but not least, is making sure that we have some flexibility as we go forward to address what is absolutely an uncertain future. So let's talk a little bit about the numbers. These are estimated changes in revenues below what it was that we estimated in February. So about 5 or 6 weeks ago, I think that was when we proposed the original budget. Since then, we've estimated an almost $56 million drop in revenues, mainly in two areas. One is the taxes that I have mentioned previously, sales, mails, and some smaller taxes like car rental, recordation fees, and also other non-tax sources that I mentioned previously. And you can see here, under the principles of revenue sharing, where each tax dollar that comes to us, the schools receive 47% of that dollar. Well, similarly, when we have revenue reductions, schools have to share in 47% of the tax revenue reduction. So you can see here that county taxes are down 24.4 and schools are down 21.6. If you actually, what happens if you add those both up, you come to about $46 million in tax revenues that have dropped. And that split there between the county and schools is based on the revenue sharing principles. Now, non-taxes, which I just described what they were, none of those are either shared with the schools, or in this case, which means the burden of that non-tax drop falls exclusively on the county side of the ledger. So that's a long way of saying, of that 56 million, the county now has a $34 million less than we assumed in February, and the schools have 21.6 million less than was assumed in the February budget. So a little bit more here about the impact on schools. You can see that with the reduction in this revised proposal, the schools still are receiving a slightly larger amount of money than what was included in the fiscal 20 adopted. But you can see it is that $21.6 million less than the original proposal in February. And I just walked you through the 47%. Now, we're working very closely with our school partners. They, just as we are, going through some very stressful times, and wanted to applaud them for the approach they're taking on virtual education. You will see that there are some unknowns, and these unknowns will also be on the county side. For example, the federal CARES legislation, the $2.2 trillion package that was passed by Congress and signed by the president about a week ago, does include additional funding for education. And there's the possibility that there may be some state support for education. At this point, it's far too early to estimate what, if any, benefit might come from those two sources. Let's go on to the next slide. Again, I wanted to aggregate for you the totals here for taxes and non-taxes. We were just talking about the incremental changes. You can see here that for taxes in our revised proposal, this is across all sources, we are seeing a very, very slight increase, but we see a fairly pronounced decrease in non-taxes. So our fiscal 21 revised revenue estimates show that we're expecting to receive less revenue in fiscal 21 than we received in fiscal 20. And I can't recall in all my years in working on county budgets or other budgets where that situation has occurred, where one year was less than the year before. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is a visual meant to show what it is that we're actually up against. If you can see, the two big mountains here are essentially the two large payments that we receive from residents and businesses for real estate and personal property taxes. And you can see that there's essentially the monthly payments from meals, sales, and transient occupancy tax and other taxes actually act as a bridge between those two large infusions of funds. And I don't know how well you can see the arrows here down below that show that the first real estate and personal property tax payment that we can expect after the board adopts this budget comes probably in about the June timeframe. And so once that happens, we have a period of time till October where the next payment comes along. So what we're seeing here is that in fiscal 20, where we are right now, we have received the vast majority of the revenue that we expect to receive. And for fiscal 21, when that year starts, we will have received the June payment. And so we will start off in a fairly good position. But quickly after that, there's a lapse of time where we will see some effects of those non-tax revenue sources that I described, and also some of the tax revenue sources. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay. I know we spent a lot of time just now talking about what it is we're not going to be able to do and what it is that we've lost by way of revenue. But we still have a lot, and I wanted to focus on that. We're going to have a county workforce with all the jobs in place, no changes to benefits. We're going to continue the investments that I laid out in the proposed budget in February, which included an increase in housing grants and funding for permanent supportive housing. And we will maintain the Affordable Housing Investment Fund at the adopted levels for fiscal 20. And then we're going to, as you can see, we maintain essential county services. One thing that's important to focus on with that is even though we're able to maintain essential county services, we had, for the last 2 budget years in fiscal 19 and 20, we made cuts to a lot of county programs. I had hoped that fiscal 21 was going to be the year that we would have been able to address some of those pent-up demands for really very legitimate and needed investments in our community. We're not going to be able to do a lot of those, which is unfortunate. However, we're not going to have to, at least at this moment, cut essential county services. So let's go on to the next slide. Just a few more left. The changes we're making on the expense side, this is again changes from what was proposed in February. Even though we're maintaining all county positions, I think that it is called for in this circumstance to eliminate all compensation increases. So we had proposed salary increases somewhere between 3.25% and 6.5%, depending on the position. I'm proposing to eliminate those. And as I mentioned, we're slowing hiring. I also mentioned some exceptions here. We had programs that had received some very positive feedback for traffic control officers, expanding the library here and the Bosman Building, Courthouse Plaza, and some other programs. We're not going to be able to do those. And we also had hoped to add additional planners, an additional arborist, and also to expand some library collections and do some additional tree maintenance. I'm proposing that we freeze those proposals, and we're not going to be able to do them. And significantly, as I have mentioned, I think in a previous meeting, though we're going to continue with the construction of Longbridge Park and Aquatics Facility and with the Lubber Run Community Center, both of which are under contract and which the work continues on, I didn't think it was appropriate at this time to incur additional expense to open either of those facilities in fiscal 21. So I'm proposing we delay the openings to no earlier than July of 2021, which would be the beginning of fiscal 22. Okay, a couple of other things. We normally, in our rhythm here, our fiscal rhythm, we normally would go in around May or June to the financial markets to sell bonds. I am suggesting we not do that this year. We've had conversations with Arlington Public Schools, and for us on the county side, deferring a bond sale will not cause us a significant slowdown in any of the projects we have currently underway. And because of that, we'll be able to save some debt service, about $6 million worth of debt service. We also have the challenge of the Metro budget, which I'm happy to talk about at greater length. The Metro Board adopted a budget last week, which they have said they will revisit. So I have included the funding that I think appropriate there, and we can talk about that in greater detail. We will have a long list, which we will make available this week, of new projects that we had proposed for fiscal 21 that we're going to either cancel or defer. Some projects currently underway that we're going to hit the pause button on and redirect some of those funds towards filling this revenue shortfall that we have. Also, we have, thanks to the action of the board, in the last few years, set aside some additional money in a rainy day fund, or as we call the county stabilization fund. And I'm going to suggest that we tap a portion of that, though certainly not a significant portion of that, given that we will need to replenish that if we draw down. Let's go on to the next slide. So there are things that I have made reference to some of these, and I wanted to spend a minute or two on these. And by the way, I know since we have a large number of people following this at home, that all this information is laid out in much more exacting detail in a memorandum I have sent to the board, and which has been posted on our website, which is 17 pages of single-space detail. So a lot, we're distilling a lot here. So what I've also done in this proposed revised budget is set aside essentially a contingent that is made up of $10.2 million. And I've split that contingent basically into two pieces. If you'll recall, when I proposed the budget in February, I had hoped to increase the amount of investment in the AHIF fund, the Affordable Housing Investment Fund, by $2.7 million. What I've done is I've taken that $2.7 million and said, rather than it going into AHIF, let's set it aside to deal with housing and safety net needs. For example, helping people to prevent evictions, potentially increasing housing grants given the greater need in our community, and then also help with food assistance for our community. I've made mention on the next bullet, you can see I've made mention to small business support. We have a small business grant program, which I've suggested to you, which may need additional funding beyond what I've proposed, and this would be the place to go and get it, which would be this contingent. And then also we need additional funds for employee programming, perhaps, whether it comes to mental health services and those kinds of needs. And then I will tell you, we started work on this revised budget about 14 days ago, and as each day has gone by, we continued our work based on a set of assumptions. I'd say the situation has deteriorated further in the economy, so this would be one place you could go to handle additional revenue shortfalls. Next slide. What is it that we don't know? Well, we don't know that we know there's a chunk of money that was set aside in the CARES Act for local governments. And we know that the Commonwealth of Virginia has will receive a portion of that funding. We do not know how the Commonwealth is going to distribute those funds and on what basis. So this slide is showing where we might get additional funding in the future. So remember what I said earlier, the numbers I've laid out here in this proposal will have to be revised a number of times. And once we receive that information, and we hope to receive it before you move to adopt this budget at the end of this month, that will provide us additional relief, we hope. We do know that under the Community Development Block Grant Program, that Arlington County, due to the formula nature of the program, will be receiving approximately another $830,000. We do not know when that will arrive. And there's been a lot of conversation out there that some of the programs stood up by the CARES Act and the additional funding, it's taking quite a while, for example, for people to access the unemployment benefits and some of the small business benefits. So we will be relying on the efficiency of the federal government, and I will just let everybody evaluate whether they think that's something that we can rely on fully at the moment. And then also the potential for other state funding, though I think that the state will be under some of the same stresses that we are. So let's go on to I think the last slide, which lays out the schedule. We are here at April 6th. School board is going to propose its revised budget. The superintendent on April 16th. I'm proposing a work session on the 16th. And there are the dates of the required public hearings and potential county board adoption, and school board budget adoption, and then fiscal 21 begins in July. And two things to say in conclusion, and then I will, you don't have to hear my voice anymore. First is that we still are required under the Code of Virginia to adopt a budget that is balanced and is in place by July 1. And in order to have all our deliberations sync up with the required payments to us in June of real estate taxes, we essentially have to finish up very close to the end of April. There is not a lot of wiggle room there. I wish there had been, but there is not. And then in conclusion, what I did want to say is I wanted to thank very much our Department of Management and Finance staff that have been literally, this is no exaggeration, working for the last about 20 days. They've been pulling between 12 and 18-hour days and juggling a whole series of responsibilities. So I know I covered a lot, and there's a lot to unpack here. And so, but with that, I will conclude my presentation and turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schwartz. I'd also like to thank everybody. I have a lot of feedback right now. Does anybody else hear that same feedback? Okay, hopefully nobody hears it but me.
Madam Chair.
We hear it.
Yeah? Can you hear it?
Yeah, we are hearing it. You have an echo.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to do about that. Let me turn my microphone on and off. See if that's any better.
Libby, do you have any other devices on?
Let's see. Yeah, they've been here all along, but they're not close. They're not on. They would be picking up sound.
That's better.
It's better.
You did it.
Better.
Okay, put phones on the floor for whatever it's worth. Thank you. All right. So I did want to thank our manager. I mean, to me, Mr. Schwartz, this budget is both wise and strategic, and under incredibly difficult circumstances. Thank you. There's part of me that can't resist realizing that you're modeling equity, innovation, and resilience with this, which is what we're going to need to just get by. So I appreciate everything you and staff have been doing. I know there's a whole lot more work to come. I wanted to verify one thing. I'm not sure if I heard you say, but probably a lot of people are interested in, which is the tax rate. You're still considering that the tax rate will stay the same as it is this year. Is that correct?
You know, yes, actually, that I didn't say anything about that, so I'm glad you brought that up.
That's okay.
My budget, my revised proposal here is recommending to you to keep the tax rate where it was that you advertised it at. And let me speak about that for a second. I know that there are members of our community that are less well off now than they were before, but my feeling on this is that to the extent that we need to assist our residents, that the real estate tax is in many ways not the best approach to provide financial relief to people. It does not address those people who do not own property. It does not make distinctions among people in their specific circumstances. So that's the reason why I have focused more on relief associated with the basic needs and sort of assistance through those other set of programs I laid out.
Thank you. Thank you for discussing that. I think that was of interest, I'm sure, to a number of people. Colleagues, any questions for our staff? Just kind of shout out and we'll start and see if there are any questions or discussion at the moment.
I'm sure I'd be happy to begin. Yes. I have a couple. First, with regard to the CDBG funding that we hope to receive either in fiscal 20 or fiscal 21, does that also route through the state or does that come directly from CDBG to us?
My understanding, and I know Samia, you were on here, I have not read that specific section of the CARES Act, is that comes through the federal government to us directly.
And I know that normally when we allocate that money, it's sort of through a strategic plan document, right, with a couple of key community priorities. Will we have flexibility to push that out to meet the most immediate needs in the areas that you ticked off, Mr. Manager, emergency financial assistance, food, eviction prevention, or will there be more sort of strings to that money to be allocated?
Now, what I've been told is that this comes with an increased amount of flexibility and not as many strings attached, but we will have to make sure that that is the case once we receive written guidance.
Okay. I also had a unrelated question, maybe it makes sense to ask and then to yield the floor here. But Mr. Manager, you showed us, this was like the slide before the peaks and valleys slide. Unfortunately, they're not numbered, so that's the best I can do. But you made a comment about receiving less revenue in one fiscal year than the prior. Could you just clarify whether that was, we expect to receive less revenue in fiscal 20 than in fiscal 19, or is it we anticipate less in fiscal 21 than fiscal 20?
Based on our estimates right now, which I've stated for the record, we know are not completely correct. We right now are estimating that the full revenue we will receive in fiscal 21 will be less than the revenue we're estimating we receive in fiscal 20.
Okay. Can you help reconcile that for me with, I think when you were showing us, maybe it was the slide previous to this one now, with schools in particular, that we do anticipate, the revised revenue transfer will be slightly higher than fiscal 20
Correct.
Funding level. So those two facts can be true. Is that because of the non-tax revenue sources?
That is correct. The non-tax revenue sources are the ones that on a percentage basis will be more severely impacted. And since the benefit and the harm that comes with that is not shared with the schools, that falls on the county side of the ledger.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And just for the record, I want to just clarify again, slightly higher, the schools transfer, slightly higher than fiscal 20. Can you put a number on that? I think I was trying to do some quick math with a prior slide, but how much more than the fiscal 20 level of the schools transfer?
Yeah, $2.2 million.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, that does it for my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. And I realize as your chair with this virtual way of doing things, it's tough if I don't actually just call out on people. So I'll go to Mr. DeFranti next. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a couple of questions. First, I appreciate the focus on those most in need in this time, the housing grants continuing, permanent supportive housing as well, and the mental health docket position, which I noticed in the memo you described, the 17-page memo. I did want to just ask, I'm really pleased that you're considering over the coming week some funding for the employees who are within 6 feet on a day-to-day basis, our first responders in this crisis of all different types. But have you done some consideration as to whether there are a few who provide services to the homeless directly that are inside that 6 feet that we provide funding? Have you done thinking yet? I know you want to be very precise as to how we do this, but is that the sort of group of nonprofit providers that we have historically partnered with that you might consider also in that sort of in the next couple of weeks or coming 2 or 3 weeks with our county employees first? Is that a group that you might also consider for that sort of targeted first responder type pay?
Well, I think that the question you're raising is about our nonprofit providers. I said that many of them really are on the front lines, similar to our employees. So I think some of those same principles would apply. I tell you, if I'd had more time, I would have come up with a little bit more thoughtful proposal on that. But because of the wonders of our system, that issue now rests with the board. I would be very comfortable with that kind of approach. But again, it's going to rest with the board to make that decision. But I would support it.
Great. I appreciate 12 to 18-hour days for your entire team as well as you. So I absolutely appreciate all you've done to get to this point, and want to be targeted, really focused on those who are right in front trying to help those in need in a particular crisis now. So the only other question that I had was about, I just had a chance to scan a little bit the elections component and the 0.3, or I think it's 0.3 million that is in there for next year to help with the 2020 election. I think it feels a little premature on where we're headed as far as all elections, but certainly voting by mail has a lot of appeal to me. And so I'm wondering if, do I understand correctly that the 0.3 million is not yet including that possibility, because state law will change, as I understand it, for the fall elections on mail-in ballots, but there might be a scaling up that we would want to do to keep folks safe. So that's one of those details that would have to come in the next weeks or month. Is that right?
Right. So yeah, I'm going to actually ask if whether Maria or Richard, who may have had any conversations with Gretchen Reinmeyer, who's our registrar, about that, because I can't give you the precise details on the numbers, how the numbers were arrived at.
It's
I'll
Michelle.
jump in.
Oh, it's Michelle.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
The numbers that are included, the 300,000 was the request of the electoral board when we did the February budget, and all the things that they needed to handle the November election. We have not had the opportunity, unless Michelle has had some additional conversations with Gretchen since in the last 2 or 3 weeks, to see if there are any additional needs. This just retains all the funding that the electoral board requested as part of the initial proposed budget.
Yeah, I've been in contact with Gretchen on a sort of a weekly basis, and they are in the near term, though. You're right, the funding is exactly for that. They're expecting, hopefully, getting some announcements on this spring and summer, and then also fall by the governor within the next week or so, is what they've been hearing. So that might influence what we need for 21. There are also, though, near-term deadlines that we need to work through with her. So we've already scheduled a planning meeting with her on that, because she has some near-term deadlines in terms of when she opens up absentee balloting and all that kind of stuff. So elections are still happening. It's how we approach it in the best way, and we'll be back in touch with you guys.
Great. I asked about fiscal year 21. Part of your answer seemed to touch fiscal year 20, and I'm just appreciate that you're in communication already on this. Thanks. That's all I had.
All right, thank you. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions. One, Mr. Schwartz, I do appreciate the overall strategic direction that this budget is going in, and I very much appreciate that we are taking adequate contingencies in if, in fact, this gets a lot worse. The question does rise to me. What if it, in fact, gets better? What if we are able to receive some upside good news in terms of revenues? Do you have an idea or a thought as to what you would do with any budget benefits that we would see after the first quarter, and how you would choose to deal with them?
So thanks for that question. You know, I have in a part of my brain which was really quite active before all of this, I'll call it the fun part of my brain, said, what would happen if things actually got better? There would be two areas that I would focus on. One would be, depending on where we were economically, I do think that compensation for employees would be something I'd like to put back on the table. And then I think there were some of the initiatives that I put out there, and actually, you know, well, we call them initiatives, but there are a number of places where we made proposals, and I'll give an example. I would really like to be able to take better care of the trees in the county, and right now the sort of the pruning schedule we have is at an incredibly very long. It's just not reasonable, and there's a lot of impacts that continue to happen in our environment where we might have wanted to be able to make additional investments. So I would go back to that list of items that we had proposed in February and sort of pick through those and see what we might be able to add back.
Thank you. And if I could, just one other question at this time, Madam Chair. I know you've been in contact with Arlington Public Schools, and I was just curious if you had a sense as to whether or not the revenues that you anticipate being available for them will allow them, like us, to maintain their critical infrastructure for when we get past this, or whether this is going to cause a significant structural change in their service delivery model.
So the only thing I know for certain, and I've had several conversations with the acting superintendent, is that her approach is going to be similar to what we've done, looking at reserves as a way to bridge from where we are now to when things get better, and also taking a look at compensation for employees. There are, I think, some other options that she had been weighing. I don't know where she's going to end up on that, but we will all find out towards the end of next week.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Colleagues, anybody have come up with another question they'd like to ask
Madam
staff?
Chair?
Yes,
Yeah.
Ms.
If I may.
Crystal. Yes.
Thanks very much. So the first thing I guess I wanted to just to surface is a little more of that, I suppose the inverse of Mr. Dorsey's question, a little more of that, what happens actually if things do get considerably worse. You know, I think we talk a lot about the reserves in the county, the different reserves that we have, the different funds, our goal of not only maintaining, but in fact increasing our currently 5.5% of the general operating budget in reserves. Could you just talk, Mr. Manager, a word or two more about, you've described, for example, the COVID contingent, but what contingents, what reserves would be in play if in fact things get considerably worse?
Okay, so we go into a lot of detail on this in the memorandum, but let me just start by saying that if things got worse, the places that we would look, first we would look at cutting back on even more capital projects. We would examine, I would bring you proposals about reducing program levels. As far as reserves, I think that's an important conversation to have. Leaving aside the $2 million that was provided as a contingent for me as part of the adopted fiscal 20 budget. Leaving that aside because there's about $750,000 left there. The county has two big buckets of reserves, a 5.5% general fund operating reserve, and I right now have no intention of tapping into that. That is something that you use when essentially life as we know it would come to a complete halt. And that would be if we had multiple waves of virus over a period of a year or two. I would look at that. But we still have another bucket, which is this economic stabilization contingent, where we have at least $7 or $8 million left. That would be one of the places I would look. In addition, levers that I have chosen not to exercise and ones that I would be really very, very reluctant to propose to you would be to go back and look at the Crystal City tax increment financing district, which is by policy. Some of that money is set aside for Crystal City, and also look at balances we have in our development fund. I would look at both of those before I would look delving into that 5.5% reserve. So that's my answer for now, and happy to take any more questions on it.
I appreciate that. I had an unrelated question, but I'll pause in case anybody else wanted to follow up on the reserve.
You've got the floor. Keep going.
Okay. I'm just looking over the memo that you've shared with us and with the community by extension. And the reference within that COVID contingent to the small business and recovery investments is somewhat slim. And I know there's a whole lot more thinking going on about what that pool of funds might look like, who might qualify for it, the size of the grants they could aim to qualify for, and so on. When would we expect, or the broader community expect, to see additional details there?
Well, you'd expect to see it in the next 10 seconds because Telly Tucker has made a mistake and made himself available for this work session, and so I'm going to turn it over to him.
That was like a magic trick. My goodness.
That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Mr. Tucker.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark and Madam Chair and members of the board. I'll just very quickly kind of outline what we would propose to roll out over the next month. Essentially, while we know that the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the entire economy it's fundamentally disrupting those industries that rely on in-person interaction, specifically our small retail, hospitality, and personal services business. Based on more than 100 one-on-one consultations that we've completed to date and a survey with more than 600 responses, it's clear that access to near-term capital is essential for the survival of many of those small businesses. So the proposal would be to use existing funds that had been allocated for the Gazelle grant program. They amount in about $674,000 currently, and to use those in the emergency bridge grants. Without getting into the detail of those, we would, over the next month, flesh out an application, program guidelines, scoring rubric, and an application portal that our small businesses could then go online and apply. Given that Arlington has more than 6,000 small businesses, we understand that these funds would not be sufficient to provide a grant to every affected business. However, we would recommend providing grants of up to $10,000. Therefore, at least 60 businesses would be able to receive funding relatively quickly. And based on the consultations that we've had, many businesses need less than $10,000. So depending on grant requests and funds available and the number of qualified applicants, I think we could fund more than 60 grants at this time.
And we anticipate nonprofits, arts groups, and others would be eligible as well?
Yes, absolutely.
And hopefully the answer is yes to this, but just to clarify, so really appreciate the rapidity with which this would be rolled out. Really, it sounds like even ahead of or coterminous with the budget adoption process. Based on the number of applications that you all receive and both the amounts and then the number of businesses that might generally be eligible, would it be correct to assume that you and the manager might come back to us, or the manager might use more funds out of the contingent if we see an opportunity and indeed a need to help considerably more businesses than this pool of $674K can assist?
Yes, absolutely. And we would be in direct communication with the county manager's office, and I'm sure that message would be relayed to the county board as well. Really, I think we will learn much more about each business's need as we open up this application portal and they submit what their grants requests are and how they plan to utilize these funds.
Thank you. I'll yield the floor to colleagues, but I really appreciate that.
I'd like to just follow up a little bit, Mr. Tucker, if I might, and I really appreciate the speed with which you've been setting this up. Are you anticipating of setting up sort of a triage system? You know, there's a medical triage, and is there an economic triage to sort of determine who should, first get it? Because obviously we can't do everybody, as you said, but there may be some cutoff of a group of businesses that, we can put in some more money, and that is maybe the most strategic businesses we should make sure we are able to help bridge this gap. Have you thought about that? I imagine you have, but if you'd like to talk about that, it'd be great.
Sure, absolutely, Madam Chair. We've developed a framework, which I would describe as a funnel, whereby we would evaluate businesses that apply through, I would say, 3 phases of examining the need. The first would be simple eligibility criteria, such as whether the business meets our definition of small business of less than 50 employees, initially, whether they are in good standing with Arlington as far as taxes, pre-existing tax liens or legal judgments prior to COVID-19, whether they can demonstrate a revenue decline of at least 35%, et cetera. Businesses who met the basic criteria would then move to a second phase of analysis that determines how many jobs they would be retaining or supporting with the funds that would be available, the length of time that the business has operated in Arlington. There would be additional consideration for small, women, and minority-owned businesses. Essentially, every business needs to demonstrate the percentage of lost revenue and the economic hardship that they faced as a result of COVID-19, and then communicate how those funds would be utilized. After that kind of second phase of reducing the number of qualified applicants, we would get to kind of a final review and economic analysis of the resiliency and sustainability of those businesses. These are taxpayer funds, and we would like to invest them responsibly with businesses who who have shown resiliency and sustainability over the years, and have a highly likelihood of continuing to sustain themselves post COVID-19. So that's a little bit of the framework that we've set forth as well. It's still being formed as we continue to have conversations with existing businesses and some of the partners, some of the other granting organizations in the community who regularly disperse grants, and we'd be looking for more guidance as well from our county leadership and of course from the county board.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll be looking for recommendations from you as well. And it's really good to hear how much you've thought this through, and appreciate that. Thank you. Colleagues, anything more for our staff, or Mr. Tucker, Mr. Schwartz, anyone else? Mr.
Just
Dorsey?
one.
Yes, Mr. DiFerranti.
Just one more that's sort of along the lines, fully support the quick work that's being done on businesses, and glad that nonprofits both are all being done in a targeted way. That 10,000 limit has a lot of appeal to me. This is more for the manager on the 2.7 million. I've read a little bit in the memo, but that is essentially a contingency that would be used, I would imagine, for things like potential additional needs in housing grants or Thrive to prevent displacement of people. Are those the primary? It seems like the right focus to me to still be on housing, but to do so in a do no harm and help people stay in their homes. Are those the primary things you were thinking of?
Yes.
Great. Okay. It's not that other things couldn't be done, but those would be the first two. Okay. Thanks.
That's correct. Sure.
Yep. Great. All right. Mr. Dorsey, do you have any questions, comments at this point?
I am good, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Okay. All right. We all good? All right. Thank you, Mr. Schwartz and your team. This is just truly remarkable what you guys are doing. Really, really appreciate it. I hope everybody makes sure they get some sleep, because this is going to go on for a while. I need to make a motion, colleagues, and I will like to move that the county board convene a closed meeting as authorized by Virginia Code sections 2.23711A4 and 8 for the following purposes: 1, a personal matter not related to the business of the county board, and 2, consultation with the county attorney concerning the provisions of Chapter 7, Title 15.2 of the Code of Virginia pertaining to the composition of the county board, and consultation with the county attorney concerning the authority of the county board and the county manager during the pendency of the state and local emergency declarations and the actions that can be taken in response to the emergency and to protect the public health and safety. Could I have a second, please?
Second.
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. I should call the roll, shouldn't I? All in favor, please say aye. Mr. Dorsey?
Aye.
Ms. Crystal?
Aye.
Mr. DiFerranti?
Aye.
All right. And Ms. Garvey? Aye. All right. Thank you very much. We are now recessed and in closed session. Thank you all. All right, the county board is back in open session. Colleagues, I need to make a motion. I move that the members of the county board certify that at the just concluded closed session 1, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under Chapter 37, Title 2.2 of the Code of Virginia, and 2, only such public business matters as were identified in the motion by which the closed meeting was convened were heard, discussed, or considered by the board. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Thank you. Our clerk will call the roll. Ms. Jacobs?
Ms. Crystal,
Yes.
Ms. Garvey,
Yes.
Mr. DeFerranti,
Yes.
Mr. Dorsey.
Yes.
All right. Thank you all. Ms. Jacobs, is there anything else to come before the board right now?
No, there is not.
All right. Thank you very much. All, we are adjourned.
Thank you.